Okay, thanks for joining. We have a wonderful parsha, a lot to talk about. Great energy, great stuff. It's also exciting because one of the major themes of this parsha is it lists all the holidays and gives you a rundown and insight into all the Jewish holidays. So you can, whichever holiday you like the best, now is your time to talk about it. Everybody has, what their favorite holiday. So there's so much meaning and so much insight from the history. Um, and from history to philosophy to psychology, everything is wrapped up in this week's parsha. The beginning of the parsha refers specifically to the commandments that apply to the priests. Um, and then we move to holiness that applies to everybody because that is the holiness of the holidays because everybody celebrates the holidays. So one way to think about the book of Leviticus, in Greek, it's called Leviticus from the tribe from the word Levi, tribe of Levites, which is the priests. Um, we don't really call that well, I guess we call it Torah Kohanim. The Medrash refers to this book as the book of the priests. And the beginning, it talks about the laws of offerings and the temple. So we talk about holiness in the context of specific space in the temple and in the context of specific people. But in this parsha, we move to the holiness of time. And the holiness of time is the holidays. And the holiness is not just for a specific class of people, but it's for all the Jewish people. So that's sort of a shift from what we were talking earlier in the book. In any case, we'll do as we usually do, is start with the parsha in a nutshell, and that gives you time to see the big picture of the parsha, the big ideas, and it gives you time to think about if there's anything specific you want to raise. But here we go. The name of the parsha, Emor, means speak, and is found in Leviticus chapter 21, verse 1. The Torah, this section Emor speaks, begins with the special laws pertaining to the Kohanim priests, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and the temple service. A Kohen may not become ritually impure through contact with a dead body, save on the occasion of the death of a close relative. So there's 7 relatives that a Kohen could become ritually impure for contacting them or going to the funeral. The Torah lists those specific relatives, very close relatives. A Kohen may not marry a divorcee or a woman with a promiscuous past. A Kohen Gadol, which is the high priest, one person, the high priest, can marry only a virgin, and it doesn't say it here, but he cannot become impure, even when it comes to a relative. He can't even go to his own relative's funeral. A Kohen with a physical deformity cannot serve in the holy temple, nor can a deformed animal be brought as an offering. A newborn calf, lamb, or kid must be left with his mother for 7 days before being eligible for an offering. One may not slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. So this is sort of the end of the laws of offerings in the book of Leviticus. The second part of Emor lists the annual callings of holiness. That's how we refer to the holidays, Mikra e Kodesh, callings of holiness, which is an interesting word. Maybe we can elaborate upon that. The festivals of the Jewish calendar, the weekly Shabbat, the bringing of the Passover offering on 14th of Nisan, which today we would call that Erev Pesach, the day before Passover, because that's when they would bring the Pesach offering the afternoon before the Passover Seder. The 7-day Passover festival beginning on the 15th of Nisan, and then a beautiful mitzvah that takes place that we're actually in the midst of doing right now, which is the counting of the Omer offering from the first barley harvest on the 2nd day of Passover, and the commandment on that day, and the commencement on that day of the 49-day counting of the Omer, culminating in the festival of Shavuot, which is the festival of weeks, on the 50th day. In other words, you have 7 weeks, you count 7 weeks from the 2nd day of Passover until the day of Shavuot, which commemorates the giving of the Torah. So we had so far Passover, counting of the Omer, and Shavuot. Then we go to a remembrance of a shofar blowing. So that's Rosh Hashanah blowing the shofar on the 1st of Tishrei, a solemn fast day on the 10th of Tishrei, the Sukkot festival, during which we are to dwell in huts for 7 days and take the 4 kinds, beginning on the 15th of Tishrei, and the immediately following holiday of the 8th day of Sukkot, which is Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of Sukkot. Next, the Torah discusses the lighting of the menorah in the temple, and the showbread, lechem hapanim, placed weekly on the table there, which is very strange. It doesn't seem to fit into the story of the holidays, but it's obviously connected. Maybe we'll explore that. Finally, the end of the parsha is just one of the only two episodes that occur in the third book of the Torah. The third book of Torah is all about law, but there's two episodes. One is the death of the sons of Aaron, and the second episode in the book happens right here, a tragic episode. Emor concludes with the incident of a man executed for blasphemy, and the penalties for murder, death, and for injuring one's fellow or destroying his property, which the penalty for that would be monetary compensation. So that's a nutshell, again, beginning with the laws for the priests, which even though they apply to the priests specifically, but the messages are universal, and concluding and continuing to the laws of the holidays and naming and listing the specific holidays. And of course, the holidays also, that's an invitation to the meaning and the meditations behind each of the holidays, which of course are relevant all year long as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the beginning of the parsha, which talks about how a Kohen is not allowed to become impure. So let's see if we can find, actually read it in the text and summaries, read it in the screen, and more Torah reading. Here we go. So this is the opening statement. God said to Moses, "Say to the priests, the sons of Aaron, you must say to them, no one may ritually defile himself among his people on account of a corpse." So a Kohen cannot become impure for a corpse, except for his close relative, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, and his brother. Regarding his virgin sister, as long as she was close to him, in that she was not married to a man, he must defile himself for her. So these are the six relatives that are written explicitly, and the rabbis derive there's a seventh, and that is his wife. And they get that from the verse 2, where it says, except for his close relative. That's not the best translation. It says, Lisheiro, his relative who is closest to him. So that's, the rabbis say that refers to wife. So you have wife, father, mother, son, daughter, brother, and sister under some circumstances. Nobody else. And that's a very important point. A priest is not allowed to become ritually impure. Why not? What is the symbolism? What does this teach us? So there's a very interesting point of contrast that I never realized until it was pointed out, until I saw it written at one of the commentators. And he says like this: if you drive around and you look at other faiths, you will see that their house of worship usually has a cemetery next to the house of worship. That's the way it is. Look around Greenwich next time you drive around town. He says that the Judaism is the opposite. The cemetery cannot be next to the house of worship. In fact, there was no cemetery in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the place for the temple and the place for the priests, and you had to be ritually pure, and therefore there was no room for a cemetery in Jerusalem, because that would just create the impurity. And in fact, the famous biblical, the famous cemetery that goes back to biblical times outside of Jerusalem, Mount Olives, was outside the borders of the original Jerusalem. So this is very interesting. What does this tell us? Go ahead, Dr. Cameron, please.
Maybe an obvious question, but it never really jumped at me like it did now. Why in the world is death, which in many ways is honored and celebrated, although we do say the Kaddish, which refers not to the death, but to life. Why is death considered impure?
That's a good question. That ties in. And isn't death the moment when people become spiritual,
Yes,
closer to God? And in Judaism, you see that all the time. There's a fascinating verse from King Solomon who says it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to a wedding. You know, what's more exciting? Most people would prefer to go to a wedding. The food is better, the dancing is better, the music is better. But King Solomon says you go to a wedding, okay, it's a nice experience. But you go to the house of mourning, Then you start thinking about matters of mortality. You think about your soul. You think about the afterlife. You think about what's meaningful to you. So it seems that it seems that's the most spiritual thing is the funeral. I know myself. I go to a funeral. It's a very spiritual experience for me.
Right.
So how come the priest is deprived? So Rabbi Darren happens to be a Kohen, a priest. So I do a lot of funerals because he can't. It has to be, there are ways he can do it sometimes. But yeah, so that sends me on the funerals. And I think I'm always moved. It's a spiritual experience. You learn about somebody's life. You learn about what's important in life. You learn about what is going to matter to you at the end of your life. You learn about what people are going to remember of you. It's a fascinating, it just is a very powerful experience. So why are we saying, oh, priest? No, priest cannot come in contact with a dead person. And like I said before, while other religions are going to put the cemetery next to the place of worship, in Judaism, no, the temple, I don't mean the synagogue, but I mean the temple is the antithesis of death. And that's why also we don't have synagogues funerals you don't have the cemetery next to the funeral. So the idea is as follows. Yes, of course, death is not ritually impure. Death itself is not impure. In fact, the Talmud makes the point that the corpse is not impure. The person touching the corpse is impure. Now, it seems just like a technical matter of law, but symbolically, what this represents is a very powerful point, what we're discussing right now. Death is not an impure experience. What death does to us may lead to impurity, okay? But death itself, for the soul, for the person passing on, death is not impure. But the question is, what does it do for us? And we talked about this a little bit, that death brings about mortality can have when a person considers their mortality, it could have negative effects that can make a person sad. But I don't want to relitigate that. We discussed that a few weeks ago. If you want to, I can mention it again. But what I want to focus is, what is the job of the priest? What is the purpose of religion? So for many people, purpose of religion is to make you spiritual and prepare you in a way for the afterlife, right? Down here, okay, this is the domain of the physical. You have a good time, but you want to make sure when you go to the afterlife that you're saved. So what do? You go pay your dues in the house of worship. You show up whenever they ask you to show up, and they're going to take care of you in the afterlife. And so it's beautiful. You're actually buried next to the church. If you get in, I don't mean church, I mean a house of worship. If you get into any trouble, the house of worship is going to save you. So in other words, that comes from an idea of what is a religion. Religion is to teach you how to become more spiritual. And that is also an idea, but that's not what Judaism is. And that's not what the priest represents in Judaism. In Judaism, the idea of religion is to infuse the material with spirituality. It's to bring it down in the physical world. So what is the Kohen? The Kohen is the person is supposed to demonstrate how the spiritual and the physical could unite, how you could do something in the physical world in a holy way. So the death, the corpse, which is the reality of the separation of body and soul, and nothing wrong, because that's the way of the world. We're on this planet for a certain period of time, limited period of time, compared to the infinite time that the soul lives. The soul is eternal, and the soul goes back and has a spiritual existence. Okay, beautiful. Nothing wrong with that. That's what I'm saying. The corpse itself is not impure. The soul itself is certainly not impure. Soul itself is alive. The body itself is also, even the body is not impure. But the point here is, what is our job? What is the symbol of the person? What is the purpose of religion? What is the symbol that the priest is supposed to show? Not that religion is going to show you how to die, how to retain the afterlife. No. Religion is here to show you how you could live in this world in the physical sense and bring holiness to the physical. So the separation of body and soul is the antithesis to what the priest is supposed to do. Or to summarize it, if you need to do it in a tweet, because today we're in the Twitter age, or in a TikTok video. I don't do TikTok, but I'm sure some people, we have to be concise. The notion that religion is not here to teach you how to be spiritual, or religion is here to teach you how to connect the spiritual and the physical. It's a total different experience. And that's alluded to with all these laws, where the priest is the antithesis to death, because death is purely spiritual. And that's not what we're focusing on. That's not what our mission on this earth is, even though that's an important journey as well. But that's not for right now. That's not the goal, and that's not what the priest represents. So that's one point that's always nice to think about. Another point, which is fascinating, is that this is very interesting. There is a law, like I said, the priest is not supposed to become impure unless it's a very close family. If it's a close family, he is allowed to. But if he's the high priest, since the high priest is sort of even more than the priest, um, the high priest represents the greatest form of leadership, but leadership means commitment to others. So the high priest doesn't have any personal life. The high priest can't say, well, I have a personal need. My grandmother passed away, my mother passed away, I have to go to the funeral. No, you represent the people. You're a symbol for the people. You're not a private person. So the high priest is not allowed to become impure for any relative, which is very powerful. By the way, that is also what we saw earlier in the book, because the first high priest, Aaron, we read the story a few portions ago in the portion of Shmini, that the day the temple was inaugurated and the day that Aaron performs the service in the temple, two of his sons die. And God tells him exactly what God is telling the other high priests. God tells him that he is not allowed to mourn. He has to continue performing the service of the temple. And ironically, the rest of the Jewish people will mourn for the death of the sons of Aaron, but Aaron himself cannot. So there's an idea where it's not about you, it's about the collective, and you have to represent the community, the high priest, to the extreme that even if it's your own relative, close relative, the high priest cannot go and become ritually impure by engaging with the body and participating in the burial, etc. But there's a fascinating rabbinic teaching that says that there's a concept called met mitzvah, which is a corpse that is a mitzvah, or a dead person that's a mitzvah. What does that mean? If there is somebody who passes on and does not have any relatives, or doesn't have any relatives that are present, nobody can take care of this person, that person is called met mitzvah. He's a dead mitzvah. In other words, there's no one else to take care of him. So it's a mitzvah for anybody to take care of this person. In that case, the Talmud derives from the verses here in the Torah that a priest and even a high priest must, not only they can, but they must suspend their own holiness and become ritually impure to take care of that person. Because the whole idea here is of service is to be prepared, if necessary, to give up of one's own spiritual well-being to help somebody else. And that's a very powerful message of people. Some people who seek spirituality, they're so into trying to become more spiritual, and it ends up having a streak of selfishness. I want to grow spiritually. I want to make sure I am quote unquote holy. So I am going to be focused on self to make sure that I attain that level. But the problem with that is that also can reach an obsession and could come to a place of being self-centered. I only care about my spirituality. But what happens if someone else has a need, and if that need, maybe that need should precede my spiritual growth? And that's the lesson that we see from this week's parsha. So let's see if Rashi says it. I believe Rashi does. So verse 4, right? So verse 4 talks about, so the previous verses say the relatives that a person could become impure to. And finally, verse 4, Lo yitama, a husband must not ritually defile himself for a wife who died among his people. This is commentary. Literally, it's not even a husband. A person, he should not become, okay, a husband must not ritually defile himself for a wife who died among his people if she caused his temporary demotion from active priesthood. Okay, we're not, let's skip the second half of this Rashi. So let's read Rashi. A husband must not make himself defiled for his close relative, i.e. his wife, as long as she is among his people, i.e. she has people who can bury her, and is thus not a met mitzvah, a death per person of a mitzvah. But the point is, if the person does not have anybody else to bury them, then the mitzvah is that even the priest and even the high priest have to become defiled. And that, again, the message is that in your quest for spiritual growth, don't forget about needs of other people. So that's a reminder for the priest. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. The irony of this is that if I say I am focused on becoming spiritual, almost at that moment, I stop being spiritual.
Right, right. So the test is, are you willing to transcend yourself?
Mm.
And it doesn't, you're supposed to grow. A person is supposed to, just like you're supposed to take care of your physical needs, you're also supposed to focus on spiritual growth. But the question when it comes, but then there's a litmus test. The litmus test is when it comes to the moment of truth of am I going to put myself before the essential need of somebody else? Then that if I fail that litmus test, then that shows that I really was just self-oriented. It wasn't really service of God. It was really just serving my own ego. So you're supposed to grow and you're supposed to try to become more spiritual and try to become a better person and grow spiritually, of course, and focus on self because we have to make ourselves better. If I'm not for myself, who is for me? Said Hillel. If I don't take care of myself, no one's going to take care of me. That's true in the physical sense. It's also true in the spiritual sense. But on the other hand, there comes a moment and says, now when there's a test of my needs versus someone else's needs, if I will always put myself first, that means that I'm not taking God's will to heart, and I'm just basically serving, self-serving. Okay, I want to just say one more point that is not related to here. It's a very small part of the parsha, but it's an important theme about blessings in general. So I think we'll take 5 minutes to talk about it because in Judaism, certainly from not in the Torah, but in rabbinic Judaism, in other words, Judaism as articulated by the rabbis, a lot of your day, I don't want to say a lot of time, but the idea of blessing God, saying a blessing, is takes up a lot of attention simply because you're not supposed to eat anything before you make a blessing. So before you eat bread, you make a blessing. Before you and every type of food, every category of food has another type of blessing. So if you're doing it, you're going to have fruit of the tree has one blessing, fruit of the earth, vegetables have another, grain has mizonot, another, bread has another, wine has another. And then there's a general blessing for other things, shahakol, everything that was made by God's word. So there's the rabbis introduced this concept of blessings over food, and because a lot of throughout the day eating is a very important practice. It's not they do it for other things as well, not just eating, but eating it's sort of the activity that fills up my whole day. Even right now, I'm drinking a coffee. Okay, so before I'm gonna drink my coffee, I have to make a blessing. So the point here is, where do the rabbis get this from? Like, where does this concept come from? So in the Torah, there's only one place where it says you have to make a blessing, and that is the blessing after you eat. Right? The Torah says in the book of Deuteronomy, you will eat, you'll be satisfied, and you'll thank Hashem. That makes sense. That's logical. Why? Gratitude. If I go to your house and you feed me, what am I going to say? I'll say thank you. What's wrong with that? That's basic decency or basic manners. So we eat from God. We eat God's food. So we say thank you. Wonderful. That makes sense. That's the biblical commandment. But the rabbis have this whole additional list of blessings that a person says. So the Talmud tries to figure out, okay, where do you get this from? Where did the rabbis pull this out of the hat? Is there a biblical source? And they try to say maybe this is the source, maybe that's the source. Eventually they give up hope and they say, no, there's no biblical source. So what's the purpose? So where do we get that notion of blessing? They say it's logic. What's the logic? Svara. They say it's a logical concept. What's the logical concept? They say, look, the world belongs to God. The verse says, La Hashem ha'aretz u'mloah. The earth and all that is in it belongs to God. So how am I going to eat an apple if it belongs to God? So I can't eat it unless I make a blessing. And the Talmud goes so far as to say that anyone who eats without a blessing, it's almost like stealing from God, because God never said you could have it belongs to God. Why are you taking it? Okay, that's what the Talmud says. But this interpretation, the Hasidic masters explain, this interpretation needs further clarification. How come? Because when you look at the blessing is more like thanksgiving. The blessing is not a request. The blessing doesn't say, God, can I please have your apple? Can I eat your tuna sandwich? It doesn't say that. So you're telling me that the reason why I eat is because everything belongs to God and I have to therefore sort of get permission from God to eat his food. But that's not what the blessing says. The blessing is simple. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, Lord, our God, the God of the universe, the creator of the fruit of the tree, or the creator of the fruit of the vine, or the creator of the fruit of the earth. It's just an acknowledgement. It's not saying, it's not a request for permission. So this is a little far-fetched. It's a little detailed, but it's a beautiful concept. So we go back to the laws, jump back to our parsha, and our parsha helps clarify because you see when we talk about the laws of the priests in this parsha, one of the things it mentions is it says in other places in Torah as well the laws of teruma. What is teruma? So if you in the land of Israel, when the Jewish people entered Israel, of course it was an agricultural society, and everybody had land. And that's how you survived. If you have no land, you're poor or you're destitute. So everybody gets land, except for the priests. The priests get no land. The priests and the Levites get no land. And this is a big deal because if you look in Egypt, the Torah tells us, and that's the fact, the priests get, not only do they get land, but they get more land than other people and they get tax free. So it's good to be a priest because you have a spiritual position in the temple and you also have land if you're in Egypt. But in Israel, if you're a priest, you're destitute. You're totally poor. You have no land. You can't even grow. You can't even grow a morsel of food. Okay. So how did the priests survive? So there's something called teruma. Teruma is a gift that the Israelites give to the priests, and the priests have to eat that food. The problem, so it sounds nice, you get gifts, but first of all, you have to be a nice guy. If you're not a nice guy, no one's going to give you the gift. There's no guarantee you're going to get it. But not only that, there's also a lot of ritual restriction of how you can eat this produce. You have to be ritually pure. If you're ritually pure, you can't eat it. So there's all kinds of restriction of how it's eaten. Okay. Amongst those laws, the Torah tells us, well, the Levite, I'm sorry, only the priest could eat it. Nobody else could eat it. If the priest invites me to his house, I can't eat that food because I can't eat the truma. I can't eat those gifts of produce because I am not a priest. So now there's a fascinating detail here. That the detail is that if you if you're a priest and you have a servant, now in those days it was more like a slave, but let's say servant. If you have a servant, the servant, even though the servant is not a priest, the servant is allowed to eat of the produce of the Kohen, of the produce that belongs to the priests. Why? Because he's not his own person, he's part of the household. Okay. So the Hasidic interpretation says like this. What happens when you say a blessing? You say, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, Lord, our God, the King of the universe. So what are you acknowledging? You're acknowledging that you're the servant of God. If you're the servant of God, you can partake of God's bounty. In other words, what do we say? We say, I have no business taking God's things. Yeah, but if I'm the servant, I can. Just like the halacha, the law is that if I'm a servant, whoops, what's going on behind me? I'm getting some fireworks. I don't know I have no idea what this is happening. But in any case, I must have said something radical. Yeah, it was radical. If I am a servant, if I am a servant, I could eat if I'm a servant of the priest, I'm like an extension of the priest. I can eat the truma. So if I'm a servant of God, then I could eat God's produce. Why? Because I'm doing it to serve God. Why am I engaging in the physical world? So I can fulfill my purpose and mission in the world. So I think this is absolutely fascinating because it basically tells us that everything we do in this world, we're doing it. If we're doing it for our own sake, then maybe I have no business doing it. How am I enjoying God? God created a beautiful universe, but He never told me I could use it, right? So where do I have the sort of more moral justification to use it? But if I acknowledge that God is the creator, oh, so I'm the servant. Oh, if I'm the servant, I'm serving Him. Why am I eating lunch? So I can have energy to go do good in the world. Oh, now of course I can eat it because the eating itself is part of the recognition of God's creation. So I think that's beautiful, and I think it ties into the idea that we're all we're all priests. The priests were full-time priests, but we're all priests. We all have that. We're all supposed to have that awareness and attitude that we're here. It's not just a mundane life, but it's life infused with spiritual purpose. So that's a little bit about the priests, and now we go to the fun, which is the holidays. So think about what's your favorite holiday and why you like it so much, and we'll think about what the significance of the holidays. But we could even talk about it even before that. We could talk about the verses that introduce the holidays. This is fascinating stuff. I could sit here all day long. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit. This is Leviticus chapter 23. This is the fourth section of this week's parsha. By Daber Hashem, God spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, with regard to God's appointed holy days." Okay, I cannot read this translation. I have to redo this. Leviticus chapter 23. Right, 23, Chabad.org. Yeah, this is better. Had the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed holy days that you shall designate as holy occasions. These are my appointed holy days." And it starts listing what are the holy days. It starts with Shabbat, verse 3. And the verse 3 is Shabbat, right? We read verse 3. For 6 days work may be performed, but on the seventh day it is a complete rest day, a holy occasion. You shall not perform any work. It is a Shabbat to the Lord in all your dwelling places. And then verse 4, it introduces this again. These are the Lord's appointed holy days. We already said it in verse 2. We'll talk about that. No, it has to be reintroduced. These are the Lord's appointed holy days, holy occasions, which you shall designate in their appointed times. And then we start with Passover and we go through the list. So first, a few questions. First of all, why do you have to introduce it twice? Verse 2 introduces it and verse 4 introduces it again. So that's one important distinction. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, well, I have another question about Shabbat. It says there, and maybe that's the translation, because it says in 6 days labor may be done or it should be done. So
Very
do you
good.
have it should be done or may be done? I mean, I think it should in some other place.
Hey, Aseh, the work may be performed. That's very interesting. It's the same phraseology throughout the Torah. It's very hard to say if it's 6 days work will be done, should be done, may be done, right? It's very hard. In biblical Hebrew, it's a little bit vague, and it's very vague in many different occasions. So, for example, the verse that I mentioned earlier, "V'sava v'achata," you will eat, you will be satisfied, and you will bless. Okay, the will in each one means something else. The first two is you may eat. There's no mitzvah to eat. You may eat. You may be satisfied, or if you eat and if you're satisfied, uberachta, you shall bless. Right? So in that phrase itself, some of it is you shall, and somebody is you will, meaning you could do it, and one is you shall, it's a mitzvah. Here too, it's vague. But the Medrash says that the phraseology that says 6 days you should work, or I'm sorry, 6 days work will be done, the Medrash says it means work shall be done. And the Medrash says it's actually a mitzvah. So the mitzvah is not just to rest on Shabbat. The mitzvah is to work 6 days and then rest on Shabbat. In fact, the commentaries point out the Torah never says to rest on Shabbat in isolation. Never does it say take vacation on the seventh day. It always is preceded by 6 days you shall work. So I'm going to say it shall work because that's what the rabbis say. But a simple meaning, it's vague. I'm not going to say it means you may work. I'm going to say it's vague, which is also a very important point going back to what we talked about in the beginning. The purpose of this is very interesting. What is the purpose of Shabbat? The purpose of Shabbat, we say, well, all week you're busy, and all week you're distracted. You're too busy paying the bills and doing your errands or whatever else you're doing. Shabbat is a time to designate to matters of the spirit, to family, to meaning, to purpose. Okay, so Shabbat is the goal. But the commentaries say, 1 second, it's not so clear that Shabbat is the goal. Maybe Shabbat, the purpose of Shabbat is to influence you in the 6 days, right? So when you go back to work, you'll go back in a way that's infused with spiritual values, right? There's 2 ways to look at it. One way to look at it is, okay, you have no choice. You have to work for 6 days. And Shabbat is finally you get to breathe again in the spiritual sense. But maybe there's a way to read it where the purpose of Shabbat is to extend into the 6 days. And that's why the Kabbalists talk about Shabbat. There's one way to read it that Shabbat is the end of the week. But there's in other matters of law, and the Kabbalists talk about this, other matters of law, Shabbat is the middle of the week. And the way we see it is Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're preparing for Shabbat. And Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Shabbat is extending to the rest of the week. So Shabbat is the middle. And that's why there's a law that there's a service you're supposed to do after Shabbat called Havdalah, which is similar to the Kiddush, which we do in the entrance of Shabbat to sanctify the day when the Shabbat enters. There's also a mitzvah to sanctify the day when Shabbat concludes. So after Shabbat, there's a ceremony, a cup of wine, a flame, a fire, and incense. You smell spices, and that's how you make a designation between the week and Shabbat. The law is, what happens if I forgot or I didn't make this blessing on Saturday night? You're supposed to do it Saturday night. Or you live in a place where there is no Saturday night. My brother lives in Iceland. In the summer, there's no Saturday night. So when do they do it? They do it Sunday morning. What happens if you forget to do it Sunday? So the law is you could do it until Tuesday. Why? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday is a continuation from the previous Shabbat. Oh, and this way you read it, Shabbat is the center of the week, and the purpose of Shabbat is to sanctify the rest of the week. So again, the point is not rest on Shabbat. The point is rest in Shabbat so that you can go work for 6 days, so that the holiness affects the rest of the week, so that your spiritual connection will not remain in the world of spirituality, but will be brought down to sanctify the mundane, which is the theme of what we're saying in the entire, again, it's a radical idea. It's just not radical to us because we say it every day, 10 times a day, because it's a fascinating concept about Judaism. But in this way, Judaism is very different than most most religions and most spiritual traditions, because the orientation is completely different. We're not trying to transcend, we're trying to sanctify. Okay, so that's going back to the idea of 6 days you shall work. Okay, let's think about this for a second. There is a very big difference between Shabbat and the holidays. What is the difference? The difference between Shabbat and the holidays is technical differences about what may be done and what may not be done. We're not going to get into the technical differences right now, even though we could, but maybe we'll do that for next step. Whatever. That's not the first item on the agenda. The big difference between Shabbat and the holidays is the question of in other words, who chooses or who decides when the holiday happens. And the way the Talmud puts it, the Talmud says, Shabbat mekadsha v'kaima. That's Aramaic for Shabbat is holy and it stands. Meaning to say, you do not have to do anything for Shabbat to happen. Every seventh day is holy, regardless of what you do. Nobody has to do anything to make the Shabbat happen. Okay. Contrast that with the holidays. The holidays is specifically days that are designated by the Jewish people. Why am I saying so? Of course, the Torah says Passover is on day 15. Of course, 15th of the Hebrew month. But who decides what's the Hebrew month? Who decides what day 1 is? So here there's a fascinating concept in Judaism that the people have to look up to the moon. And when they see the new moon, they have to declare it. They go to the court. 2 witnesses have to see the moon. Then you go to the court in Jerusalem, and then the court interrogates them to make sure they actually saw the moon, and then the court declares it new month, Rosh Chodesh, day 1. And there's fascinating stories in the Talmud about questions and disputes that happen because of this. But the bottom line is, if the people don't call it the new month, there's no new month. So in other words, who decides what day Passover is? It's the people. Because you can't have the 15th of the day of the month before you have the first day of the month. Now you look back at the verse and you'll see what the verse is trying to signal, right? Look at verse 4. These are the Lord's appointed holy days, holy occasions, which you shall designate in their appointed times, right? God doesn't decide when Pesach is, when Passover is. Yeah, God says the 15th of the month, but when is that? That does not happen through God, that happens through the people. Again, contrast that to Shabbat, where Shabbat is decided by the people, by God himself. Let's see if Rashi makes this point here. No, I don't see. Okay. So what am I trying to say here? So that's how Shabbat is different, is different than the holidays. Oh, one more point about this, and then we'll make the broader point. By the way, that's why you look at the liturgy. You look at, let's say, the Kiddush, the blessing you say to sanctify the Shabbat, or you look at the prayers. When it comes to Shabbat, all the prayers and all the all the prayers and other kiddush, we say, we thank God, we say, talk about the day, and we say, Mikadesh HaShabbat. God sanctifies the Sabbath. Why? Because God sanctifies the Sabbath. We don't make it holy, God makes it holy. When it comes to the holidays, here we have a little bit of a different phraseology. Instead of thanking God for giving us the holiday and saying God sanctifies the holiday, we say God sanctifies Israel, meaning the Jewish people, and the times, and the appointed times. And the Talmud says, why are you sticking in Israel? You don't say God sanctifies the Jewish people on Shabbat. God sanctifies the Shabbat, because God sanctifies Shabbat directly. When it comes to the holidays, God does not sanctify the holidays directly. God sanctifies the people, and the people sanctify Shabbat. I'm sorry, and the people sanctify the holidays. So this is a very important point, and I'm going to get back to that point in a minute. I'm going to try to come back to it. You know what? Let's come back to it right now. Let's just add a few more pieces on the puzzle on the table, and then everything falls into place. So I'm going to ask you a very simple question. It sounds like it's a very simplistic question, but just to introduce the concept. Okay, let's say we're in a relationship, and the question is, who is supposed to take the initiative? Who is supposed to decide? I don't know, where we're going to go on vacation, what we're going to eat for dinner, how we're going to spend our time. And a lot of couples fight about this. There's some tension. You want to go here, I want to go there, or I want you to decide, you want me to decide. I'm not going to confess to you because we're unrecorded, but in my family, I can never decide where to go. It's a big problem. My wife wants to say, let's go somewhere. I don't know where to go. So I'm very bad at this. But the question is, so whose responsibility is to take the first step? And it's not just where we're going to go for dinner, but in all matters. So let's say we have a dispute, and let's say we got into a little fight, and I am totally happy to apologize to you. But I want you to apologize to me first. So people don't talk to each other for 30 years because each one's waiting for the other one to take the first step. So the question is, who takes the first step? Whose responsibility is it to take the first step? And the answer, of course, is that in a mature relationship, both parties have to take the first step in different times. If you're living together for 30 years or 40 years, and one party is the one who always takes the initiative, then it's imbalanced relationship. It's a relationship like parents and children, where the parents do everything for the children. But in a mature relationship, sometimes you take the first steps, and sometimes the other person does. Because if I always have to take the first step, or if the other one always takes the first step, that's not going to be healthy. Okay. Now let's think about the relationship with God. Who takes the first step in the relationship with God? So here we have this idea. There's two different types of holidays. Some holidays represent the fact that God, because of his kindness, is going to come down and he's going to help you. Even if you're not deserving, even if you're not worthy, God is going to step in. May take him some time, may take him 200 years, but he's going to show up. What is that? That's Passover. What does Passover represent? The Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt, but they were not in a very spiritual place. The Talmud, the Medrash says that the Jewish people were also idol worshippers. They were not spiritually refined. God came to take them out of Egypt. Why? They weren't necessarily deserving. It's because of their oath to their grandparents, whatever the case is, the reason. But more importantly is, what did they have to do? Answer, nothing. God did all the heavy lifting. God dispatched Moses and Aaron. God brought the 10 plagues. God did everything. The people just had to go along for the ride. So this is the God is like, we're like the woman. God is like the man. That's the metaphor. God is the man with the woman. God is the groom with the bride. And God is courting us. What happens after God courts us for 6 months? He gets tired. And he says, you know what? I'm tired of calling you. Now, I want you to call me. And now I'm not picking up the phone. You call me, you text me. And what we call that Rosh Hashanah. What's Rosh Hashanah? Rosh Hashanah is God says, pick up the phone and call me. Okay, there were no phones then, so instead of calling it a phone, what do we call it? A shofar. What's shofar? What is the mitzvah of the shofar? Call to God. Why do you have to call to God? God knows we're here. He knows our address. Why can't we just communicate to him? No, we have to call. Why? Because that's what Rosh Hashanah represents. Rosh Hashanah represents now, unlike Passover, where God takes the first step, now we have to take the first step. So God will forgive us, but we're supposed to take the first step. So there's two types of holidays that represent both steps in the relationship. Sometimes we say, I'm waiting for God to inspire me. I'm waiting for an opportunity to open up. I'm waiting for the sun to shine, and then I'm going to be happy, and then I'm going to be inspired, and then I'm going to call my grandmother. sometimes you say, I can't wait for external inspiration. I can't wait for God to do this for me. I have to take the initiative. I have to take the first step. And even if I'm not inspired, I have to push myself and I have to call and I have to create and I have to generate. So it's bottoms up, not just top down. And both are important. And in a healthy relationship, you're going to have both. So that's a nice point. But now let's add even one more piece in, and this becomes beautiful. If you look at the Hebrew calendar is all based on the phases of the moon because it's a lunar calendar. So day 1, let's start with the easy. Day 15, the moon is full. Anytime you'll go to your Passover Seder, as long as you could see the moon, maybe it's a cloudy day so you don't see the moon. But if anytime you go to a Passover Seder, if you look up, you're going to see a full moon. If you see a moon at all, if like I said, if there's no clouds. Rosh Hashanah is day 1. What happens in day 1? Barely any moon, maybe rebirth of the moon, very little moon. So the Medrash says that the Jewish people are likened to the moon. You know, different cultures have a solar calendar because they're fascinated by the sun. The sun is powerful, the sun is mighty, the sun is consistent. But our story, the Medrash says, our story, the Jewish people, is much more like the moon. We're not the strongest out there. We don't have the most powerful lights, but we wax and we wane. We have downtimes, we have uptimes. We're not consistent, but we're always reborn. Even in a place where you think you're going to be able to destroy the Jewish story, no, it's going to reemerge. And that proved true over Jewish history. But one way to think about that itself, so the sun is the light that the Jewish people reflect. So the light of the sun represents the light of God, and the moon, our job is to reflect the light of God. Okay, now let's think about this. Some holidays, Passover, Sukkot, happen on a full moon. That represents that we are inspired by the light of God. We don't have to do much. Passover, the spring is in the air. We think about all the things that God did for us. The light is shining. It's wonderful. Rosh Hashanah is a time where day 1 on the calendar, there's no light. God is not shining at us. God's not calling us. What's the purpose of the holiday? You call God. You pick up the phone. You inspire yourself. You say, God, I don't feel connected. I want to become close to you. I want to become close to myself, to my own values, to my own soul. But the point is, don't expect it to come from the outside. It has to come from within. And that's why on Rosh Hashanah, there's very little light of the sun being reflected on the moon. Or being shining onto the moon, reflecting, because now is not a time for the sun to shine. Now is a time for the moon to call out. And then you get to the third holiday, which is fascinating, Shavuot, when we get to Torah, and here it's day 7, and day 7 means half a moon. One way to think about that is like a partnership between God and the people, because that's what the Torah is. The Torah is God's shining, the light is shining, but in other words, God gives us the written Torah, so it's top down. Torah is a top-down document. God gives us the principles. God gives us the 5 books of Moses, what we call the written Torah. But in Judaism, the Torah is about the oral Torah as well, the rabbinic interpretation, which is the human struggle to understand and apply the Torah. And that's critical to Torah study, because here it's the part of the people, the people's involvement. And the Torah is a partnership between the inspiration and the wisdom that comes from above and the human contribution and the human application. And that's why the holiday of so Passover is top down, and Rosh Hashanah is bottom up, with the people turning to God. Shavuot, the day we celebrate the holiday, is the union of both of them. And that's how you see that even the phases of the moon of the holidays is dependent on, it reflects the spiritual message of that day. So I thought that was beautiful. I would like to say this. It's probably not the first time you heard me saying this, but I really like this interpretation. So I keep saying it to plug into it and get the energy and get the feeling. Okay. Now the question is, one more point. There's a lot more to say. There's so much to say, but okay, let's go back to the beginning. I remember the opening question was, why are we starting with Shabbat? Especially in light of what we just said, that verse 2 seems like it's an introduction to holidays, but Shabbat is very different than the holidays in the sense that it's not We don't designate it. God designates it. So let's look at verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed holy days that you shall designate as holy occasions. This must be referring to holidays that are established on the calendar, the days of the month, because that's what the Jewish people have input. These are my appointed holy days. And then verse 3 is Shabbat. But Shabbat, the people don't call the Shabbat. God calls the Shabbat, as we mentioned at length. And then verse 4, because we were distracted by Shabbat, we have to reiterate that the following holidays are actually designated by the people. And that's what you have in verse 4. These are the Lord's appointed holy days, holy occasions, which you shall designate in their appointed times, and it starts with Passover. So my question is very simple. My question is, Shabbat does not seem to fit in the list of holidays. It's a different animal. Shabbat has nothing to do with the holidays. Holidays have to do with the Jewish people's actions of sanctifying the time and making it a holy occasion. Shabbat has nothing to do with the people, right? Shabbat commemorates the fact that God created the world, and God created the world before there were people, and whether or not the people recognize it or not, Shabbat is a holy day, and it has to do with God's actions, not so much with the people's involvement. So why is Shabbat, what is Shabbat doing here? And it's a very important question, not because it seems like a technical question, but once you get to the answer, you see that there's a tremendous philosophical point here. And the point is like this. There's different ways to say it. I'll start with the more theological point and then get to the more spiritual point. What does Shabbat celebrate? Shabbat celebrates that God created the world. Okay, fine. Let's assume that's the case. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We don't know, right? In a way, you don't know. But what is Shabbat? We weren't there, right? I wasn't there when the world was created, so it's hard to know. But Shabbat says God worked for 7 days, created the world in 6 days. The seventh day he rested. So what is Shabbat? Shabbat is to commemorate creation. Okay. The question is, could you really celebrate creation before you celebrate the holidays? What do I mean? So just to introduce this, if you look at the Ten Commandments, God took the Jewish people out of Egypt, and he said, I want to give you the Torah. So I want to talk to you. So I'm going to give you 10 commandments. What's the first commandment? First commandment is believe in one God. Before God could say it, God could say, who am I? Who's talking? They hear the voice. Who's talking? So the opening statement of the 10 commandments, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. So God wants to introduce himself. So on the bio, I'm God who took you out of Egypt. So a lot of the commentaries ask a very interesting question. If you're God and you want to impress the people, why would you say I'm the God who took you out of the land of Egypt? Didn't you do something so much greater? Like if I were hired to write God's bio, I would say, I'm the Lord your God who created heaven and earth, who created the universe, who created the cosmos, who created everything. Doesn't that seem to be a greater accomplishment than, okay, taking the Jews out of Egypt? So why, when God introduces himself to the Jewish people, does he say, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt? So the answer is, there's many different ways of answering this, but the answer is, God created the world. They don't have firsthand experience. But when God intervened in the laws of nature and took them out of Egypt, that they saw, that they had firsthand experience. So now they know that God took them out of Egypt, and now they know that now they recognize God took them out of Egypt because they experienced it. So if you want to zoom out a little bit, what is it really saying? Until you see God acting in creation, doing things for you that are unexpected in the universe, we don't know. Maybe God created the world, maybe he didn't. Even, the ancient philosophers believe that God started the process of creation, but he doesn't really control the world because the world is set in stone. The laws of nature are set that you can't, and he has no power to change them. So in other words, maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. We're not sure. But if you could see that God is intervening in nature and performing miracles and doing the unexpected, that reinforces the idea. Now you recognize that God also created nature. So in some ways, the holidays means that you're celebrating God's intervention into history to help the Jewish people in a miraculous way. God was present for us when we needed him. The holidays now remind us of Shabbat. The holidays now reinforce the idea that he's the creator. Because if not, maybe he's a creator. Maybe it's a belief that you know, but you don't experience it. So where do we experience the fact that God created the world? By the fact that God intervened in nature and saved us and helped us as a people. So that's more the philosophical point, the theological point. But make it a little bit more practical. The question is, when do you sense closeness to God? Shabbat is the theme of nature. Holidays are the theme of the extraordinary. Right? Shabbat is every week. Every week is Shabbat. What do we celebrate Shabbat? God created the world. Natural order. What are holidays? Holidays, something extraordinary happened. If you have a holiday, say, what are we celebrating? Something extraordinary happened. So the question is, where do you sense God? So most people, it's easier to sense God when something extraordinarily good happens or extraordinarily unexpected happens. And you say, you know what? I feel the presence of God. Some people see childbirth, presence of God. Some divine providence, something happened unexpected. I got something that I wanted. Oh, wasn't expecting it. The presence of God. So that's a beautiful thing. That's the holidays. God sort of intervenes in your life and does something that's extraordinary. But once the extraordinary thing happens, now you're reminded also not just about the holidays, but also of Shabbat. Now you're reminded if God can intervene, it's because God is the creator. And if God is the creator, the ramification of that is that even when there's nothing extraordinarily happening, nature itself represents God's presence because nature itself is an expression of God's wisdom. So in the final analysis, when the extraordinary thing happens, that teaches us to experience and relate to God also in the ordinary. So that's why the Shabbat and the holidays come together, because the holiday, which is the unexpected, reminds us of God's presence with us, and God's being is with us, not just in the extraordinary, but ultimately also in the ordinary. So that's the story in short. A lot more to say about the general concept of holidays plus the specifics, but we'll stop here because it's 1:00. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.